That brass latch had been fighting her for 3 whole days. I noticed it the way I notice most things, quietly and without making a scene. It was a regular Tuesday morning in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, with a light snow dusting the ground outside. Eleanor was standing at the marble kitchen island, wrestling with her vintage, deep crimson leather document box. Her bottom lip was tucked between her teeth, and she was aggressively twisting a tiny brass key back and forth in the keyhole with short, frustrated jerks. By Wednesday, the routine hadn't changed, except this time she let out a long, heavy sigh through her nose and slammed the box down on the entryway console table, as if that inanimate piece of leather had just insulted her personally. "Let me take a look at it," I offered, setting my coffee mug down. But before my hand could even get near the box, she snatched it away. "It's fine, Arthur. Leave it alone." "Come on, you've been fighting with that thing for 3 days," I said. "I said leave it alone." There was a distinct edge to her voice. Not quite anger, and not quite a warning. It was that specific tone in between that 40 years and 7 months of marriage had taught me to respect, even if I didn't entirely understand it. So I didn't push. I sat back down at the table, picked up my coffee, and opened the morning paper. But I wasn't reading. Out of the corner of my eye, I watched her, the same way I used to watch a faulty load-bearing valve on an engineering site for 35 years, categorizing the problem and running through solutions in my head. As a retired structural engineer, my brain is wired a certain way. Tiny defects usually point to much bigger issues. A misaligned gear, a hairline fracture you can only see when the light hits it just right, or a brass lock that suddenly stops cooperating. Eleanor set the document box back on the entryway shelf, carefully adjusting the angle so the edges lined up perfectly with the wood, and walked into the bedroom without looking back. Sitting there with my cooling coffee, I thought about our son, Nathan. He hadn't called home in 4 months. For a man pushing 40 with his own life and career in Boston, that wasn't completely unusual. But I still missed him in that ache of a way you miss something you can't quite put a name to. Then I thought about our daughter, Sarah, who lived just 20 minutes away and seemed to be the only person in the world I could count on to always pick up the phone. I looked back at the crimson box on the shelf. I figured if I could just fix that lock, Eleanor would come home and find a perfectly working latch. A small thing, but those are the small things that keep a household running, that make a person feel looked after, and make 40 years feel like they were worth it. I folded the newspaper and stared at the box. She'd be happy to see it fixed, I thought, and that was enough for me. At 9 o'clock sharp, she left for her book club, just like she did every Wednesday morning. I heard the low mechanical hum of the garage door, the sound of her car backing down the driveway, and the heavy thud of the automatic door closing again. The house went completely still. I stood in the entryway for a minute, just listening to the silence, the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the living room, the hum of the refrigerator compressor kicking on, the whole neighborhood settling into its lazy Wednesday morning rhythm. Then I took the box off the shelf. I brought it over to the kitchen table and examined the brass lock closely for the first time. Sure enough, 2 tiny internal teeth inside the cylinder were bent inward, likely from someone using the wrong key or forcing it too hard. The latch mechanism itself was slightly warped. A single drop of precision lubricant, a pair of needle-nose pliers, and a steady hand would have done the trick. But I didn't want to risk it. I didn't want to scratch the aged leather or get oil on the interior lining. The leather was high quality, beautifully crafted. It needed a professional. I grabbed a canvas tote bag from the back door hooks and slid the box inside. Before picking up my car keys, I took out my phone and texted Nathan, "Hey son, free this morning? Give me a call when you can." I left the phone face up on the counter and waited for about 30 seconds. Nothing. He was probably buried under another project in Boston, just like he'd been for the last few months. I pocketed my phone, grabbed the tote bag, and walked through the hallway into the garage. It was freezing in there, and my old Ford still smelled like the pine air freshener Sarah had clipped to the vent last Christmas. I backed out slowly, checking my mirrors twice out of habit, just like I'd done every morning for the 12 years we'd lived in this house. The drive to downtown Doylestown took only 15 minutes, Parking is easy on Wednesday mornings. Over the years, I'd been to Leo's antique repair probably 30 or 40 times. A belt repaired here, a briefcase restitched there, and once a pair of dress shoes resold for a retirement dinner I hadn't really wanted to attend. The owner, Leo Vincent, knew my face the way a local craftsman knows a reliable regular. It wasn't exactly a friendship, but something quieter and more durable. I drove with the heater on low and the radio off. I'll be back before she gets home, I thought. She'll never even know it left the house. When I pushed open the door to Leo's shop, the bell above gave its familiar, muffled, double chime. That familiar smell hit me instantly, rich, deep, with a faint hint of animal grease and beeswax, the distinct scent of things built to withstand time. The shop sat in a narrow storefront on Main Street, sandwiched between an independent coffee roaster and an art gallery. Leo had run the place for 28 years without ever changing the layout or the sign, which I always took as a mark of reliability. When I walked in, he was behind the front counter, leaning over a women's riding boot with an awl. He looked up, his face wearing that easy expression of someone who never had to fake enthusiasm for a customer. "Arthur," he put down the awl. "Morning, Leo. Haven't seen you since March?" "April," Leo corrected, wiping his hands on his low-hanging leather apron, Rieseling those brown Oxfords. "Right, April." I nodded. "You got a minute to look at this today?" I set the canvas bag on the counter and pulled out the crimson leather document box. The brass lock is jammed. 2 teeth near the cylinder are bent inward, and the latch is a bit warped. I didn't want to force it and ruin the old leather around the keyhole. Leo took the box. His hands were experienced, the hands of a man who read objects the way other people read facial expressions. He turned it over, running his thumb along the brass trim, pressing gently on the corners. "Nice piece," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "Full-grain cowhide, hand-tanned, not cheap." He looked up at me. "Your wife's? Her birthday is next month. I wanted to get it fixed and surprise her before she noticed it was gone." The corner of his mouth twitched slightly, not quite a smile, but close. "Sentimental and practical," he said. He turned the box over again, checking the bottom, then set it down on the counter. "I can have this done by 2. Lubricate the cylinder, gently bend the teeth back, realign the latch. $60. Perfect. I'll be back at 2. If you finish early, give me a call." I buttoned my coat, gave him a nod, and turned toward the door. Behind me, I heard him carry the box into the back workshop, the scrape of his stool against the concrete floor as he sat down to work. The bell chimed again as I stepped back out into the chilly October air of Bucks County. The sky was an unbroken sheet of gray, the clouds hanging low, carrying that crisp bite that meant snow was on the way. I stood on the sidewalk for a second, turned up my collar, and walked back to my car. Done by 2, I thought. Home before she even suspects. At 1:47 p.m., my phone rang. I was sitting in the living room with a reheated cup of coffee and a crossword puzzle I'd already given up on this morning. The TV was on low, broadcasting the local news. Eleanor was upstairs in the master bedroom, and I could hear her moving around, the familiar creak of the floorboards near the closet, the sound of drawers opening and closing. I looked at the screen. Leo Vincent. Arthur. His voice didn't sound right. There was a tension in his flat delivery that I'd never heard before. Completely out of character for a man who usually weighed every word. "Is there an issue with the box?" I asked. There was a pause on the other end. Brief, but heavy enough that I felt it clearly. "You need to come back down to the shop right now." "What's going on?" "Just come down, now." Leo's voice dropped to a near whisper. "And Arthur, don't bring your wife." I set the crossword puzzle on the coffee table. I looked up at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of Eleanor walking around upstairs. I kept my voice perfectly level. "I'll be there in 15 minutes. I yelled up the stairs, letting her know I was heading to the hardware store. Eleanor didn't ask what I was buying. She rarely did. When I pushed open the door to Leo's shop for the second time that day, the bell above felt like it chimed in a completely different key. Or maybe it was just the way I was listening to it. Leo was standing at the counter, but he didn't greet me like he had that morning. He just turned around and walked straight back into his workshop without a word. I followed him down the narrow hallway. which smelled of leather oil and old wood, past shelves packed with tools and spools of waxed thread, and into the small back room where he did his real work. Everything was laid out under the magnifying lamp on his workbench. The crimson document box was open, not just unlocked, but completely disassembled. The interior lining had been pulled up, and the wooden bottom panel was removed, resting flat on the table. There, on a clean sheet of butcher paper, several items were meticulously arranged. The way Leo had spaced them out told me he had absolutely no idea what else to do with them. They were things I had never seen before. 4 full-color photos, printed on standard white paper. They showed Eleanor and a man I didn't recognize. He looked to be in his early 40s, wearing a dark jacket, with the kind of painfully ordinary face that would instantly blend into any crowd. 2 of the photos were taken in the lobby of a high-end hotel in Center City, Philadelphia, and the other 2 were in a hotel hallway. They were incredibly sharp, leaving no room for doubt about what they captured. Beside the photos was a single piece of paper. It had been folded into quarters, but was now smooth flat. Printed in a clean, small font were 12 numbered steps under a stark title, Transition Plan. I read the first 3 lines, and a cold weight settled deep behind my chest. Step 4. Establish a consistent log with the primary care physician regarding cognitive decline, ensuring at least 60 days of written medical documentation. Step 5. Execute financial power of attorney. Must structure transfers to avoid federal flags. At the very bottom of the page, a single line was heavily underlined. Target completion date, December 15th, 2026. Next to the printout lay a small yellow sticky note. It had 2 lines written by hand, the hidden records, or the financial audit, whichever cuts deeper. I read everything twice. Nothing in the room changed. The lamp kept humming, throwing off its quiet heat, and the scent of leather still filled the air. Leo stood to my left, arms crossed, his jaw tight. He didn't watch me read. Instead, he stared at the wall, giving me as much privacy as an 8 by 10-foot room could possibly allow. I folded the yellow sticky note back along its original creases and placed it back next to the photos. I stared at the deadline on the plan, December 15th. I didn't even have to do the math to know what that meant. 9 weeks, give or take a few days. Arthur, Leo's voice was barely a whisper, you need to call the police right now. Don't go back to that house tonight. I looked at the list, the photos, and finally at that casual note about the stairs and the medication. My structural engineer's brain, after a few seconds of absolute shock, started functioning again with terrifying clarity. I imagined what would happen if I dialed the police department at this exact moment. Local officers would show up at my house. Eleanor would act completely devastated and shocked. She would say those photos were old and taken out of context. She'd claim the checklist was just a private journal entry, an anxiety list, written by a worried wife trying to cope with her husband's supposed health issues. She'd say the sticky note was a complete misunderstanding, maybe a draft for pest control. She would say all of this calmly, with the quiet confidence of a woman who had rehearsed the scenario 1,000 times. The police don't just arrest someone over a strange note and a few photos of infidelity. With no physical harm done and no hard evidence of financial theft yet, it would just be dismissed as a messy domestic dispute. All I had were 4 printouts and 2 pieces of paper. I needed a lot more than that. Not yet, I said. My voice was steady, which actually surprised me. Not yet, Leo. He turned his head and stared at me. Really stared. Do you understand what is written on that paper? I understand perfectly. Then what are you waiting for? I picked up the folded sticky note again, looking at those 2 handwritten lines, and then set it down. The handwriting was the exact same script that had signed every single one of my birthday cards for the last 40 years. I'm waiting, I said quietly, until there isn't a single door left for her to walk out of. When I got home that night, she was already asleep, or she was pretending to be. After 40 years, I still couldn't always tell the difference, and that thought, which used to be a harmless quirk of marriage, now carried a deadly weight. I undressed in the dark, walked over to my side of the bed, and lay on top of the sheets for a minute before pulling the comforter over myself. The mattress dipped slightly under my weight. Eleanor didn't move. Her breathing was slow and even, the same familiar rhythm that had put me to sleep for decades. I kept my eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Outside, the street lamp cut through a gap in the curtains, throwing a thin amber line of light across the plaster like a fault line. My eyes traced that line, and I forced myself not to think about how I felt. I only focused on what I knew to be true. Fact number 1, her document box had a hidden compartment. The design was incredibly seamless, completely unnoticeable during everyday use. It had been there long enough to collect 4 photos and 2 written documents. This wasn't an impulse. This was a long-term calculated plan. Fact number 2, the transition plan had 12 steps. By my calculation, at least 4 of them were already done. Step 4, establish a consistent log with the primary care physician, was clearly underway, or at least I had no reason to assume it wasn't. The plan explicitly stated 60 days of written documentation. That meant this whole thing had started by October at the latest, maybe even earlier. Fact number 3, Plan B, basement stairs or the sleep medication, whichever acts first. 14 words, written by the same hand that had left countless notes for me on the kitchen counter over the last 40 years. Notes that used to say, "Dinner's in the fridge, see you by 8, or don't forget your dentist appointment." The exact same hand. I didn't let my mind dwell on that last fact for long. It wouldn't help me, and it would only cause me to break down. I had to design my response the same way I would design a bridge over a massive gorge. I thought about Nathan, completely oblivious up in Boston. I thought about Sarah, an hour away, knowing nothing. I thought about what a grieving widow was supposed to look like to the rest of the world, and how good Eleanor was at managing expectations and emotions. I thought about December 15th, 9 weeks. I couldn't afford to get angry. Anger is a luxury for people who feel safe, and I was absolutely not safe. I was lying in my own bed, in my own house, exactly 62 days away from a deadline I wasn't supposed to know about, sleeping less than 2 feet away from the person who wrote it. The only thing to do now was to think like an engineer, identify the system, map out the components, find every single stress point, then build a counter system, something stronger, more precise, and completely invisible until it was time to be seen. I needed 3 distinct lines of proof. Physical evidence. I already had that. The documents, the photos, the handwriting. Financial evidence. I didn't have that yet. I needed bank records and proof of forged signatures. Medical evidence. Proof that my mind was as sharp as it had ever been, showing that any talk of cognitive decline was a total fabrication. I didn't have that either. All 3 lines had to hit at the exact same time. Any single piece could be explained away. 2 pieces could be painted as a tragic misunderstanding. But 3 pieces together, from 3 completely independent sources, dropping all at once with weeks of documented history, that would be an unbreakable cage. When every single load-bearing wall collapses at once, no lie can survive the weight. Eleanor's breathing didn't change. The amber line of light on the ceiling didn't shift. I closed my eyes and began making my list in the dark. The next morning at 10 o'clock sharp, Leo unlocked the side door of his shop. I had texted him at 6:30, and he'd replied with just 2 words, "Side door 10." No questions asked. I always appreciated that about him. The shop was freezing. The morning heat hadn't caught up yet, and the workbench lamp threw a sharp yellow circle in the back room, while everything else stayed in deep shadow. Leo was already there. The photos and the 2 documents were spread out on the same piece of paper, exactly where he'd left them the afternoon before, as if he knew I'd be back and didn't want to disturb the scene. Next to them sat a plain matte black flash drive, the kind you buy for a few bucks at any CVS. "I photographed everything last night," Leo said. Judging by his voice, he hadn't slept a wink. "Highest resolution with timestamps. It's all on this drive." He slid the flash drive across the workbench. I picked it up and slipped it into my inside coat pocket. "The lock is fixed," he added. "The latch moves smoothly now. I realigned the mechanism without scratching any of the leather." He paused. "It looks like nothing ever happened. That's exactly what I need. He watched me pick up the photos and carefully fold them back along their original creases. He watched me do the same with the plan, tucking the small handwritten note right between them. I grabbed a piece of packing tissue from his supply rack, wrapped the papers up, and slid them next to the flash drive in my jacket. "Put the box back in the canvas tote," I said. "I'm taking it home. I need to get it back on the entryway shelf before she comes downstairs." Leo was quiet for a second, his hands flat on the workbench. Then he asked, "Arthur, what exactly are you planning to do?" I looked at him. He was 55, and he'd spent half his life working with his hands in a trade that required absolute patience and precision. I figured he understood the weight of this situation better than most people would expect. "I'm going to wait," I said, "until I have all the pieces, and then I'm going to make sure she has nowhere left to turn. And in the meantime, you're just going to go home and act like nothing's wrong?" "Yes." He picked up the crimson box, placed it carefully into the tote bag, and smoothed out the handles so they laid flat. "You're a lot calmer than I would be," he said. "I'm careful," I corrected. "There's a difference." I took the bag, thanked him, and stepped back out into the cold November morning. The streets of Doylestown were just starting to wake up. A FedEx truck was idling on Main Street, and a woman in a yellow jacket was walking a golden retriever along the sidewalk. I drove home. Eleanor's car was still in the garage. I walked in through the kitchen door, hung the canvas tote on the back peg, took out the document box, and set it on the entryway console table. The angle and the way the handles draped were identical to how she'd left it 2 days ago. Exactly 4 minutes after I got inside, I heard her moving around upstairs. I walked into the kitchen, filled the kettle, and set it on the stove. By the time the water boiled, I had 2 mugs out, coffee grounds measured, and the newspaper turned to the exact page I was reading when Leo had called me the day before. "She'll be down in a second," I thought. "Everything looks completely normal." I planned to keep that illusion alive for as long as it took. At 8:23 a.m. she came downstairs. I heard her on the steps before I saw her. The familiar creak of the 3rd step from the bottom, the soft drag of her slippers across the hardwood. I'd already poured 2 cups of coffee, the same routine we'd followed every morning for more years than I cared to count. "Morning," I said, keeping my eyes on the paper. "Morning." She pulled out her chair, wrapping her hands around the mug the way she always did in November before the house fully warmed up. We sat in a comfortable silence for a few minutes. We'd always been the kind of couple that didn't need to force conversation to fill the space. I turned a page of the newspaper, though I didn't take in a single word. "I might give Sarah a call," she said casually. "See if she wants to bring the kids over this weekend." "That sounds nice. Nathan probably won't make it down until Thanksgiving." "Most likely." She gave a soft sigh, not an unhappy one, just that natural acknowledgement of distance. Then she reached for the half and half, and in that split second her eyes darted toward the entryway shelf. It lasted only a moment. Less than a second, really. It wasn't a casual glance or a look of habit. It was the look of someone confirming a lock was still secure, quick, precise, and satisfied. Then her gaze dropped back to her coffee, stirring it slowly. Her face looked completely open, calm, and gentle, just like any other ordinary Wednesday morning. "The maple tree in the backyard looks beautiful this year," she said, looking out the window. "It really does," I agreed. I stood up and warmed up her coffee before she could even ask. She smiled and thanked me. We sat side by side under the warm kitchen light, and I kept every muscle in my face completely still. I thought about that 9-week deadline and her glance at the box. She had no idea the lock had already been opened. "More toast?" I asked. "No, I'm good, thank you." She was still looking at the maple tree, a look of pure enjoyment in her eyes. "Not yet," I told myself. "Be patient. Be exactly who she expects you to be." At 10:45 a.m., she left to meet a friend for lunch. I stood by the window, watching her car pull out of the driveway, and the moment the sound of the engine faded down the street, I went to work. I went into my study, shut the door, and opened my laptop. I plugged in the flash drive Leo had given me and opened the photos first. The man in the dark jacket, broad shoulders, average face, 2 in the lobby, 2 in the hallway, clear and undeniable. Then I opened the transition plan. I'd already read it twice, once in shock at Leo's workbench, and once in the dark of our bedroom. Now, with a pencil in hand, I read it a third time, analyzing it the same way I used to review structural blueprints that needed reverse engineering. Step 4. Establish a consistent log with the primary care physician regarding cognitive decline, ensuring at least 60 days of records before filing. That meant our family doctor, Dr. Russell, had either already been contacted or was about to be. I drew 2 heavy lines under that step. Step 7. Execute durable power of attorney, financial. That would require my signature or a very convincing forgery. Step 12. Final arrangements, no later than December 15th, 2026. I opened a fresh legal pad and wrote down 3 lines. 1. Physical evidence, secure. 2. Financial evidence, requires bank records, signature analysis. 3. Medical evidence, independent evaluation, and uncompromised physician. At the very bottom of the page, I wrote 1 word and underlined it 3 times. Simultaneous. If I only pulled back 1 layer, she would always find a way to explain it away. If I pulled back 2, a lawyer could argue it was just a financial misunderstanding. But 3 layers at once, evidence from 3 entirely separate sources, dropping with a paper trail that had been building for weeks, that would be an airtight case. She has 12 steps, I thought, locking the notepad into the fireproof safe at the bottom of my filing cabinet. I only need 3. 2 nights later, Eleanor went to bed early, complaining of a headache. She gave me her usual kiss on the cheek, and I sat downstairs on the sofa, listening to her footsteps fade up the stairs until the bedroom door clicked shut. I stayed down there with a book for another hour before heading up to grab a novel I'd left on my nightstand. That's when I noticed the drawer of the master bathroom vanity. It wasn't pushed all the way in, leaving about a 1/4 inch of a dark blue folder sticking out from the bottom right corner. I stood completely still. Eleanor's breathing from the bed was slow and steady. I gently eased the drawer open and slid the folder out. I carried it into the bathroom, locked the door, and cracked the cold water tap open to mask any sound before opening it under the vanity light. The title stared back at me. Petition for Appointment of Guardian. Probate Court, Bucks County, Pennsylvania. A guardianship petition is a legal request to have a judge declare someone legally incompetent, stripped of their ability to make their own medical, financial, or property decisions. Once a court approves it, that person loses the legal right to refuse medical treatment, manage their own money, or sign any documents on their own behalf. In short, it's a total erasure of legal independence. Under the section for the respondent, the name was filled in, Arthur James Pendleton. The paperwork was about 80% finished. Eleanor had filled in my date of birth, our address, and the kids' names. In the paragraphs describing my alleged incapacity, she had listed progressive memory loss, impaired judgment, and inability to manage financial affairs. 3 carefully worded paragraphs, written by someone who knew exactly what a probate judge would find credible. 2 lines were still blank. 1 was for a physician's signature. The other was for the filing date. Tucked into the inside cover was a business card. Martin Klein, Esquire, Estate Planning. On the back, in Eleanor's handwriting, it read, Ready on notice. I stood by that marble counter for a long time, the water running softly next to me. She didn't need me gone right away. Not yet. She needed me declared legally incompetent first. That way, every single door would be locked from the outside, any signature of mine would be completely invalid, and any objections I might raise would be dismissed by a court order as the confused ramblings of a failing mind. After that, Plan B, basement stairs or the sleep medication, wouldn't require any cover story at all. A frail old man with severe Alzheimer's, confused in the middle of a cold winter night, losing his footing on the steep basement stairs. A perfect tragedy. I put the folder back exactly how I found it, making sure that precise 1/4 inch was sticking out of the drawer. I walked back downstairs, sat in the living room with the book open on my lap, and didn't read a single word. Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock, from a car 3 blocks away, Margaret Harper has to answer that call. I left the house at 5:55 a.m. Eleanor was still sound asleep. I dressed in the dark, grabbed my coat from the back peg, and walked 3 blocks down Oak Street to where the road bends and the houses thin out. The late October morning air was sharp as a blade, and the sky was still a deep, bruised gray. I sat in the driver's seat, leaving the engine off so I wouldn't wake the neighbors, and pulled out my phone. 8 years ago, Margaret Harper had been a brilliantly sharp real estate and trust attorney. A commercial property transfer I was involved in had gone sideways. A boundary dispute involving a doctored survey report from a seller who thought creative paperwork could replace honesty. Margaret had taken just 40 minutes to find the fatal flaw in a stack of documents that 2 other lawyers had completely missed. Working with her for 3 weeks had left a massive impression on me. She thought structurally just like I did. She didn't look at the emotion first. She looked at the framework. Find where it breaks, then reinforce it, or take it down. I found her number and hit dial. It rang 3 times before she picked up. Harper. Margaret, it's Arthur Pendleton. I'm not sure if you remember me. I remember, she interrupted, skipping any casual small talk or fake surprise with the dry efficiency of someone who keeps an immaculate mental archive. 8 years ago, the Doylestown commercial boundary dispute. What's going on, Arthur? I gave her 3 minutes. No exaggeration, no emotional venting, just the facts in chronological order. The vintage document box, Leo, the photos in the hidden compartment, the 12-step transition plan, the guardianship petition, and the note about the stairs and medication. As I spoke, I could hear the faint, rapid scratch of a pen on paper on her end. When I finished, she went completely silent for 10 seconds. I counted them in my head. All right, she finally said. Here is what you absolutely cannot do. You cannot confront her. You cannot change a single thing about your behavior that she might notice. Do not move any money, do not close any accounts, and do not make a single financial waves. Any of those moves can be used against you later. It makes you look reactive, or worse, like you're trying to hide something yourself. She paused. Can you do that? Yes. There's someone else I need you to think about, she said. Your family accountant. If Eleanor has been moving assets, the accountant either knows or is being intentionally misled. Either way, that person is critical right now. Her name is Lena Marsh. She's been with us for 7 years. I'll look into her quietly. Do not approach her yourself. Another pause. Come to my office at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Come alone, and don't tell Eleanor where you're going. Understood. Arthur! Her tone shifted slightly, not softening, but becoming even more direct. You were right to wait. Most people lose this game the exact moment they discover it. I looked out the windshield at the empty street. A porch light clicked on 2 houses down. The horizon was starting to show a pale gray line. I'll see you at 2, I said. I drove back into the garage, walked in through the kitchen door, and started the coffee. 20 minutes later, when Eleanor came downstairs, I was sitting at the table with the paper. You're up early, she said. Couldn't sleep, I replied casually. Coffee's fresh. She smiled, poured herself a cup, and we didn't say another word. The morning rolled on just like any other ordinary day. Margaret's office was tucked away in an unassuming 2-story brick building in a suburban office park outside the city. The receptionist led me into a private conference room with a long table, 3 chairs and blinds angled to block out the sharp afternoon sun. Margaret was already inside, waiting with a yellow legal pad and a cup of black coffee she clearly hadn't touched yet. She was in her mid-50s, sharp-featured, with short hair shot through with silver, sitting so straight it looked like she'd never slouched a day in her life. She stood up the moment I walked in, shook my hand, and sat right back down before I was even fully settled. Take me through the whole thing again, she said, slowly this time. I want every single detail. I laid everything out on the table. The photocopies of the images, the checklist, my memory of the guardianship petition, and the text of the Plan B note. I brought the matte black flash drive Leo had given me. Without asking any questions, she plugged it into her laptop, silently scanning the images on the screen and reading through the transition plan twice. Her pen flew across the yellow pad the entire time. When she finished, she set the pen down and laced her fingers together on the table. 3 layers, that's the defense we need to build, just like I thought. Physical evidence, you have that. The documents from the hidden compartment prove premeditation. Financial evidence, we need the bank statements. If it's a joint account, We need to establish that the signature on that durable power of attorney is a forgery before she tries to use it. Medical evidence. We need a completely independent cognitive evaluation from a specialist who has absolutely no connection to your family and has never been contacted by your wife. She sketched out 3 columns on her pad, checking them off as she spoke. And all 3 layers have to be ready at the exact same time. Do you understand why? 1 layer is a story, 2 layers is a dispute, but 3 layers together is a conviction, I answered. She looked up, a flash of something like appreciation crossing her face. Exactly. She tapped her pen against the pad. There's one more key piece. Your accountant, Lena Marsh. I ran a quick preliminary background check on her this morning, and her record is clean. If Eleanor has been instructing her to handle unusual transfers, Lena is either involved or she's a witness who doesn't know she's a witness yet. I'll reach out to her through the proper channels. Not today, but soon. What do I do in the meantime? You go home, Margaret said flatly. You make dinner. You watch TV. You act like a perfectly content husband who has absolutely no idea anything is wrong with his life. You cannot show even a hint of anger. She picked up her coffee, looked at it, and set it back down. How long can you keep up the act? I thought about that amber line of light on the ceiling, the sound of Eleanor's breathing in the dark, the kitchen table, the backyard maple, and the thousands of quiet mornings we'd shared. As long as it takes, I said. Margaret gave a slow nod. Then we have a real chance. I stood up to leave. As I reached the door, I turned back. How much time do we have? She glanced at the transition plan on her screen, pointing to the date at the bottom. December 15th. 5 weeks, she said. Maybe 6 if she runs into any delays. She paused, which means we can't afford a single delay on our end. The first signs started showing up on a Sunday. They were small, quiet things, little tests that left no trace. We were sitting at the breakfast table when Eleanor set her mug down, her face a picture of perfectly crafted, gentle concern. Do you remember where you left your car keys last night, dear? I noticed you were looking for them for quite a while. I hadn't been looking for my car keys at all. I knew exactly where they were, hanging on the hook by the back door where they'd been kept for 11 years. I had hung them there myself at 7:15 the night before. Found them fine, I said, turning a page of the newspaper without looking up. Oh, good. She stirred her coffee. I just get worried sometimes. You seem a bit forgetful lately. I didn't say anything. My eyes stayed fixed on the paper, but I knew the first seed had just been planted. 2 nights later, at the dinner table, I told you last Tuesday about Sarah's dentist appointment, Arthur. Don't you remember? She absolutely hadn't told me. I was completely certain of it. By now, I was keeping a precise mental log of every single conversation we had, tracking the details the same way I used to track mechanical tolerances, noting every single deviation from reality. She hadn't mentioned Sarah on Tuesday or any other day. Must have missed it, I said, picking up my fork. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine, her palms soft, her eyes full of worry. I just think, maybe we should mention it to Dr. Russell. Just a routine checkup, nothing major. I looked down at her hand on mine. Sure, I said, whatever you think is best. That night, I sat in my study with the door shut and wrote down the entire conversation. The date, the time, the exact phrasing, the context. Every single entry was written by hand, then photographed with an app on my phone that automatically backed it up with a secure timestamp. It was a record she had no idea existed, documenting the very conversations she thought would dissolve into the everyday fog. She was constructing a version of me for a judge, forgetful, uncertain, a declining man who needed to be managed and looked after. And I was building a completely different record. She's erasing me from my own life, I thought, closing the notebook. So I'm going to make sure there's another version of the story, one she can't edit. Every Monday morning from 9:30 to 11, Eleanor had her Pilates class. She had kept that exact schedule for 6 years without fail. That meant I had a reliable, predictable 90-minute window. Over the last 2 weeks, I'd learned to view her schedule the same way I used to view a maintenance window for equipment on an engineering project. Every gap was an opportunity. Every predictable absence was an open door. At 9:45 a.m. on Monday, I left the house and drove to the First National Bank of Bucks County on Main Street. The branch was quiet on a Monday morning, the air filled only with the low hum of the HVAC system. A teller was helping an elderly woman in a wheelchair near the door, and a young man was filling out a deposit slip at a far counter. I bypassed the regular teller lines and walked straight to the customer service desks in the back, asking to speak with a fraud specialist. Not customer service, it had to be fraud. The receptionist gave me a trained, neutral look and asked me to wait. 4 minutes later, Maya Collins stepped out. She was in her early 40s, wearing a tailored dark suit, with a calm, unhurried demeanor that suggested she'd heard enough strange stories in her career to rarely be surprised. She shook my hand and led me into a private office behind the main floor. "How can I help you today, Mr. Pendleton?" she asked, sitting down and opening a notepad. "I have a joint savings account here with my wife," I said directly. "I have reason to believe there have been unauthorized transactions on that account. I'd like to review the activity for the last 12 months. Her fingers flew across the keyboard without her looking down. "I can pull that up. Is there a specific concern you have?" "I believe my signature may have been forged on an authorization document." She stopped typing and looked straight at me. Her tone shifted slightly, still professional, but underneath there was a sharp alertness. "All right," she said. "I need you to come back on Wednesday. Bring your ID and any documents you signed before this year with your original signature. We need something to use as a baseline." She paused. "Can you make it at 2 o'clock on Wednesday?" "I'll be here," I said. When I walked back into that private office at 2 o'clock on Wednesday, the afternoon sun was streaming through the blinds, casting flat lines across Maya's desk. 2 documents were laid out, each sealed in a clear plastic sleeve. She turned her computer monitor so I could see the screen clearly from my side of the desk. "I want to show you something," she said, bringing up 2 high-resolution images side by side on the screen. "On the left is your signature from the original joint account agreement, back in 2019. She tapped the screen with the tip of her pen. "On the right is the signature from a durable financial power of attorney, submitted in August of this year." I studied the 2 signatures closely. Whoever had done it had clearly put in a lot of effort. The overall shape was incredibly similar. The cross on the T in Arthur and the long drag at the end of the N in Pendleton were closely mirrored. But I had signed my name to thousands of structural blueprints, construction permits, and engineering sign-offs over 35 years. I knew the exact angle of my wrist's natural movement, with my eyes closed, and the specific rightward slant of the final letters. The 2025 signature on the right is off by about 3 degrees on the slant, I pointed out, analyzing it like a tilted support column on a bridge. And that deviation is completely consistent throughout the entire name. That means it's not a natural variation from writing quickly, it's someone consciously copying a sample. Because they couldn't completely override their own muscle memory, every stroke carries the same slight, mechanical hesitation. Maya Collins nodded, tracing the pen just above the plastic sleeve. The downstrokes all lean slightly too far to the right, a consistent deviation throughout. That's a classic sign of tracing rather than natural writing. She looked up at me. "Mr. Pendleton, in my professional opinion, these signatures were not written by the same hand." The words hung in the quiet room like a stone cracking through ice. "How much has been taken out of the account?" I asked. My voice remained steady, and I felt a small spark of pride that I could keep it that way. Maya pulled up a transaction summary on her screen and turned it toward me. 4 large transfers between June and September of this year. Each one was exactly $9,500. I looked at the total at the bottom of the screen. $34,200. "Why 9,500? I asked. Though having managed large engineering budgets, I already knew the answer. Federal law requires banks to automatically report any cash or equivalent transaction over $10,000 to the IRS, Maya said, choosing her words carefully. Intentionally splitting transactions to stay just below that reporting threshold is called structuring. It's a federal felony, completely independent of whether the funds originally belonged to her or not. Where did the money go? Into a third-party trust account. We're currently tracing the ultimate beneficiary of that account." She looked me dead in the eye. "Mr. Pendleton, we need to take action on this account. I'm going to involve our compliance officer." She paused for a moment. "I'm very sorry. I know this can't be easy news to process." I looked back at the numbers on the screen. $34,200. Gone since June. And all that time, I've been living my quiet retirement life, reading the paper every morning, warming up her coffee, even wondering if I should reseed the backyard lawn for Thanksgiving. After leaving the bank, I didn't start the car right away. I sat in the dim light of the parking garage and called Margaret. $34,200, she said after listening to my report, the sound of her pen scratching against paper clear over the line. 4 transfers, June to September, all kept intentionally under the federal radar. That's our second layer of proof, Arthur. Even if the money was technically joint property, structuring those transfers to evade the Bank Secrecy Act is a crime in itself. The signature on the power of attorney was confirmed as a forgery too, I added. The bank's fraud specialist pointed out the mechanical muscle memory deviations from someone tracing it. The line went completely quiet for 3 seconds. When Margaret spoke again, her voice carried the sharp, focused energy of a hunter watching a trap snap shut. Forgery on a durable power of attorney is a felony in Pennsylvania. Combine that with a federal structuring charge, and we're no longer talking about a civil property dispute. Is the bank going to freeze the account? I'll contact that specialist, Maya, immediately, Margaret said, her pace quick but perfectly clear. We need a soft freeze, not a total lockdown. We can't alert her yet. We want Eleanor to be able to try and initiate the next transfer. Anything over 5,000 will be flagged and delayed on the back end for 48 hours. But from her end, it will look completely normal. We need to catch her in the act the next time she reaches into that account. She'll try again, I said, looking out at the gray concrete wall of the garage. Of course she will. And when that day comes, we'll make sure the net is already secure around her. Now go home, Arthur. Keep playing your part. I started the Ford and drove back out into the quiet Wednesday afternoon light of Doylestown. I took the long way back, winding down country roads, watching the bare trees sway in the cold wind. The second layer, the financial evidence, was secure. A few days later, on a Thursday afternoon, my neighbor Frank Dorsey knocked on my back door. Frank was 63, broad-shouldered and deliberate, a man who showed friendship through actions rather than words. For 11 years, whenever the weather allowed, we'd played a game of chess on his back porch every single Thursday. It was a routine that had survived 11 Pennsylvania winters. He was never one for gossip or casual opinions. Because of that, when he walked into my kitchen using the excuse of returning a pair of pruning shears he'd borrowed 2 weeks ago, I knew instantly something was wrong. "You got a minute to talk?" he asked. We sat down at the kitchen table. He turned the shears over in his hands a couple of times, then set them down and looked at me, wearing the face of a man about to say something he really didn't want to say. "My wife ran into Eleanor's book club friend, Sarah Mills, at the grocery store on Tuesday," Frank said, clearing his throat. "Sarah told her, she told her that your memory has been failing pretty badly lately. Said you got lost on the way back from the hardware store last month, and that Eleanor is terrified and trying to figure out what to do." He looked up, meeting my eyes. She said it with total conviction, like it was a fact the whole neighborhood already knew. I looked at him calmly. "Frank, when was the last time we played chess?" He blinked, then let out a tiny, reluctant smile. "Last Thursday." "Who won?" "You did. 3 games, total of less than 40 minutes. Do I look like a man who gets lost in a neighborhood he's lived in for 11 years? Not a chance," he said firmly. "You think further ahead in chess than I do." He was quiet for a second. "That's exactly why I had to come over today, because the gossip just didn't add up." I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table. "I need to ask you a favor, Frank, and I want you to think about it carefully before you answer. I need you to look back over the last month. Every conversation we've had, every time you've seen me coming and going, every game of chess we've played. I need you to write it down. Dates, times, the details of what you observed. The more specific, the better." Frank stared at me for a long moment. It was the look of a careful man deciding whether to place his trust in something he couldn't fully see. "This isn't a small favor, is it?" he asked. "It's a matter of life and death," I said. He picked up the shears from the table and stood up. "I'll have it for you by Sunday." At the door, he paused, his back to me. "Arthur, whatever kind of game is being played here, you're sharp as a tack. I'd bet my own mind on it." On Friday evening, the snow was falling a bit heavier than usual. Eleanor was in the kitchen preparing hot drinks after dinner. Ever since the weather had turned cold in October, she'd made a habit of brewing me a cup of chamomile tea in the evenings. I sat in the armchair in the living room, holding a trade journal. But for the last 20 minutes, my focus had been entirely on the basement door. Just 2 afternoons ago, I'd noticed a change in the security camera mounted above the stairs. It was a wide-angle camera we'd installed 3 years ago, after a string of break-ins in the neighborhood. Originally, it was angled to cover the entire hallway and the landing, but I discovered the bracket had been intentionally bent down about 15 degrees. Now, the frame focused entirely on the 14 steep wooden steps leading down to the basement, an angle that would perfectly capture someone falling from the top all the way to the concrete floor below. "Tea's ready, honey," Eleanor said, walking in with 2 mugs. She set one down on the side table next to my chair. The scent of chamomile drifted up, but underneath that aroma, if you looked closely enough under the lamplight, there was a tiny shimmering film of white powder that hadn't completely dissolved on the surface of the liquid. "Thank you," I said with a smile. She sat on the opposite sofa, holding her own mug and blowing gently on the steam. "It's freezing tonight. A hot drink will help you sleep. You've looked so tired lately." "Must be the weather," I replied. I lifted the mug, bringing the rim to my lips. I could feel her eyes locked onto my movements through the dim living room light. It wasn't the look of a worried wife anymore. It was the cold, detached observation of someone waiting for a specific outcome. I pretended to take a large swallow, but kept the liquid in my mouth. I made a swallowing sound, then set the mug back on the table. "I just remembered," I said, standing up and covering my mouth. "I forgot to reply to a work email." I walked quickly to the half-bath on the first floor, shutting the door and turning on the faucet to mask the noise. I spit the tea into a clean, small glass specimen bottle I'd hidden in my pocket. I wiped my mouth and looked at my reflection in the mirror, my face pale and tight from the immense strain of the moment. That wasn't an ordinary sleep aid. If it were, there would be no need to go to the trouble of adjusting the camera angle. Early the next morning, I took the glass bottle to an independent pharmacy on the east side of town. The pharmacist, Jordan Reese, was a meticulous man in his early 30s. Margaret had already contacted him through her medical legal network to clear the way. He ran a quick screening on the sample in the back room using chemical reagents. 10 minutes later, he stepped out, his face completely pale. "It's a massive dose of benzodiazepines, specifically what looks like lorazepam," Jordan said, keeping his voice low as he slid a printed analysis sheet across the counter. "An elderly person without a prescription tolerance taking this dose would experience severe disorientation, muscle weakness, and deep sedation within 20 minutes. He looked at me, a look of profound shock in his eyes. "Mr. Pendleton, your medical records show you're on metoprolol for your blood pressure. Mixing these 2 medications at this dosage can cause a dangerous drop in blood pressure and a severely slowed heart rate. More importantly," he swallowed hard, "if you were to try and navigate a flight of stairs while disoriented and weak, then even if the fall didn't do it, my heart would simply stop in the middle of the sedation, and a coroner would assume it was a tragic accident, an elderly man with early cognitive decline losing his footing in the dark," I finished for him. Jordan didn't say anything. He just gave a heavy, somber nod. I folded the analysis sheet and placed it into my inside coat pocket. The 3rd layer of proof, the final, lethal piece of the puzzle, was complete. I had to ensure my medical counter-strategy was absolutely flawless. 2 days later, through Margaret's arrangements, I went to the Penn Medicine Health System in Philadelphia. Dr. Nora Whitman, a top neurologist in her late 50s wearing half-rimmed glasses, carried a quiet authority that came from a career spent analyzing complex brain conditions. "Mr. Pendleton, Ms. Harper specifically requested that I don't look at any of your past medical history. She wants a completely clean, unbiased baseline, Dr. Whitman said, sitting behind her broad mahogany desk and pulling out a fresh assessment packet. Are you comfortable with that approach? That's exactly why I'm here, I said. For the next 90 minutes, she put me through an incredibly rigorous cognitive evaluation. We started with the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, MOCA, covering short-term memory, visuospatial abilities, executive function, attention, and orientation. Then came a modified MMSE exam. Finally, we had a 40-minute clinical interview. During our conversation, she didn't just ask about my daily routine. She engaged me in a deep discussion about a recent engineering paper on the deterioration of old bridge infrastructure in New England. We talked about stress variations in reinforced concrete under salt corrosion. I didn't just recall the paper's data points accurately. I actually pointed out a flaw in its calculation model. When the testing concluded, Dr. Whitman set her pen down and took off her glasses. Mr. Pendleton, she said, looking directly at me, your cognitive function is entirely normal. In fact, for a 68-year-old man, your executive function and logical deduction skills are exceptionally sharp. There is absolutely zero evidence of cognitive decline, let alone any need for legal guardianship intervention. She picked up her pen and signed her name on the final page of the report, a thick 4-page document bearing the Penn Medicine letterhead. No one should ever be forced to sit in my office just to prove they aren't losing their mind, she said with a trace of quiet indignation as she handed me the report. They shouldn't, I said, taking the document. Its weight felt substantial in my hands. But some people leave you with no choice. Everything was quietly in place. The hidden compartment, the bank transfers, the lethal chemical residue, the neighbor's log, and this undeniable neurological report. Every single gear of the machine designed to destroy me had now been marked and mapped out. On Wednesday evening, I sat in my study with the door cracked open. The house was dead quiet, which allowed me to easily track any sound coming from the second floor. I heard Eleanor walking around the bedroom, and then the sound of her making phone calls. She kept her voice low with that quiet confidence of someone who thinks they are completely out of earshot. The first call went to her boastful cousin, Rick Hollis, who happened to be a subpar attorney. Rick, I need you to come by the house this Saturday at 2 p.m. Yes, it's very important. A family matter. I need you here for some support. She used that gentle, managing tone she always used when she wanted to manipulate someone. The second call went to Sarah Mills, the book club friend who had been spreading the memory loss rumors around the neighborhood. Sarah, I need a favor. Come over this Saturday afternoon. You'll understand why when you get here. The third call was the shortest and most businesslike. It went to Martin Klein, the estate lawyer whose card was tucked into the guardianship petition. Martin, Saturday afternoon. Yes, I think we're ready. All the medical notes are compiled. Be here at 3:30. I'd like to have the initial family discussion finished before you arrive. I sat in the leather chair in my study, listening as the house fell silent again. Outside, the December wind of Bucks County slammed against the windows, letting out a heavy howl. I pulled out my phone and opened my text thread with Margaret Harper. Slowly, I typed out a single line. Saturday at 2:00, my house. She's gathering her witnesses. Less than a minute later, the screen lit up with Margaret's reply. I'll park around the corner from your block at 1:30. Text me when you need me to come through the front door. All the folders are ready. I locked my screen and placed the phone face down on the mahogany desk. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath of the familiar scent of old paper and leather in my study. 35 years of structural engineering had taught me that when all the stress converges onto a single load-bearing point, the collapse that follows is absolute. Saturday morning arrived with the flat, bitter cold typical of December in Pennsylvania. The sky was a heavy sheet of leaden gray, promising a significant snowfall later in the day. I was downstairs by 6:45 a.m. The kitchen was dark, except for a single spotlight above the stove. I stood in that stillness for a long moment, listening to the quiet of a house that had absolutely no idea what was coming for it today. I filled the kettle, set it on the burner, and at exactly 7 o'clock, I sent a quick text to Margaret. Everything is on schedule. Her reply was instant, as if she hadn't slept either. "Ready. I'll be around the corner on Oak Street at 1:30. Give the signal when you want me to step in." When Eleanor walked into the kitchen at 8:15 a.m., I was sitting at the table with the paper. She was already dressed, not in her usual weekend loungewear, but in the dark gray wool blend dress she only wore for important occasions. Her hair was immaculately styled, and she had the dark blue folder tucked firmly under her arm. "You're up early," I noted. "We have guests coming this afternoon, and there's a lot to prepare." She set the folder down on the counter and turned her back to me to pour her coffee. Her movements were quick, sharp, and full of purpose. From where I sat, I could clearly see the business card for Martin Klein, the estate lawyer, clipped to the front cover. "Anything special happening today?" I asked. She turned around and gave me a smile. It was warm and attentive, the smile of a woman who had practiced this exact day in her head for months. "Just some family business I've been meaning to clear up. Chloe will be here, along with Rick and Sarah." She paused. "Nothing to worry about, dear." "I'm not worried," I said. Her eyes lingered on my face for about a second, perhaps trying to read if my response was too flat. Then she turned back to her coffee, and I dropped my eyes back to the paper. We sat side by side in the gray morning light, just as we had for thousands of mornings before. Only this time I was quietly counting down the hours. At 9 o'clock I went upstairs to shower and dress, taking my time with every single step. I put on a tweed jacket with a deep inside pocket, the same jacket that had carried the flash drive, the logs, and the toxicology reports over the last 2 weeks. Out of habit, I tapped the pocket, even though it was empty today. Every single bomb that needed to be dropped was currently sitting safely inside 3 colored folders in Margaret's office. When I came back down, Eleanor was rearranging the chairs in the living room. Her back was to me as she focused entirely on the geometry of the space. "She's building a stage," I thought, watching her from the doorway, and so am I. Around 2 o'clock they began to arrive. Rick Hollis was the first through the door. He was 62, broad-shouldered and full of that arrogant physical confidence that always seemed to fill a room before he even crossed the threshold. The way he shook my hand was the handshake of a man trying to prove he's in charge. Too much pressure, lasting half a second too long, while his eyes scanned the space as if taking inventory of his territory. "Arthur," he boomed, "good to see you, old man." "Come on in, Rick. Coffee's fresh," I said, stepping back to let him pass. He didn't go for the coffee. He walked straight to the armchair closest to the center of the room, the exact spot Eleanor had carefully placed this morning, and sat down with an air of absolute authority, as if his presence alone turned the living room into his courtroom. 10 minutes later, Sarah Mills arrived. Her cheeks were flushed red from the cold wind, and she was clutching a casserole dish she absolutely didn't need to bring. She was 64, with a face that had spent a lifetime practicing a look of overwhelming sympathy. For years, she had uncritically accepted Eleanor's version of the world. She gave Eleanor a quick embrace, then turned to me. The hug she offered me carried a deeply uncomfortable pity. Her arms stayed around me a second too long, and she gave my back an extra pat that felt entirely performative. "Arthur," she said in a lowered voice, stepping back to look at me, "you look... well." The way she said it made it entirely clear she expected me to look like a confused, fragile invalid. "I am well, Sarah," I said flatly. She gave me the kind of smile you reserve for someone who doesn't realize how sick they are, then walked over to sit near Rick. My daughter Chloe arrived third, just 3 minutes after Sarah. She walked in wearing a gray knee-length coat, unwinding her scarf, while her eyes instantly searched the room for me. 2 days ago, under the excuse of a trip to the hardware store, I had driven to a diner outside of town and talked with her for 2 solid hours. I hadn't shown her every card, but I had told her enough of the truth. She caught my eye from across the room and gave me a tiny, almost invisible nod. Then she chose a chair directly opposite mine, the one spot in the room where she could see my expressions most clearly. Frank Dorsey was the last to arrive. Using the excuse of returning a snow shovel, he stood at the edge of the entryway in his heavy winter boots, declining the offer to come further into the room and simply leaning against the doorframe. He looked like a casual bystander who had just dropped by, but I knew his inside coat pocket held a spiral notebook filled with 6 weeks of meticulously detailed notes. Eleanor stood right in the center of the room. I noticed she'd remained there ever since Rick arrived, positioning herself at the natural focal point of every eye in the space. "Thank you all for coming today," she began, her voice warm and unhurried. "I asked you here because I love Arthur deeply, because I am terribly worried about him, and because I believe it's time for us as a family to have an honest, transparent conversation." Rick gave a solemn nod. Sarah crossed her hands over her chest. I looked at the dark blue folder resting on the coffee table. Less than 2 feet away from everything changing completely, I thought. 2 feet and one wrong word. Eleanor pulled out a light blue care journal and began reading out loud. She read for 11 solid minutes. She had carefully selected the entries, the ones containing the most fictional details, the ones that sounded most convincing, and the dates where she knew I couldn't easily prove an alibi. Her voice stayed in a perfectly level, low register, the frequency of heartbroken concern rather than accusation. After each entry, she paused, letting the words sink into the room. November 3rd. Arthur forgot to lock the front door again. I had to remind him twice, and he seemed completely blank. Rick shook his head slowly, letting out a heavy sigh. November 15th. Arthur became confused about his blood pressure medication, asking me which one he was supposed to take. I had to place the pills directly into his hand. Sarah covered her mouth with one hand, her eyes shining with tears. I sat there with my hands flat on my knees, offering zero reaction, not once. I had made a promise to myself and to Margaret, and I kept it. I simply calculated the load-bearing capacity of this bridge of lies. When she finished, Eleanor closed the journal and pulled a single-page document from the dark blue folder. She walked over to Chloe and placed it on the coffee table. "This is a statement of family concern," Eleanor said softly. "It simply confirms legally that those closest to Arthur share his wife's concerns regarding his mental and physical well-being. It will support our request for the court to order a comprehensive medical evaluation by a designated independent specialist." She looked Chloe dead in the eye. "This isn't an extreme legal action, Chloe. This is just family taking care of family." Rick instantly pulled a pen from his inside suit pocket, clicking it with a loud, deliberate snap before setting it down next to the paper. "Nothing to worry about, Chloe," Rick said in the tone of a man used to giving orders. "We just need everyone on the same page, for your father's sake." Chloe picked up the paper. She read it once. She read it a second time. I didn't look at her. I looked at a family photo hanging on the wall above the fireplace, taken the year Nathan graduated from college, the 4 of us squinting into the summer sun. I kept my face entirely neutral, waiting in the silence. "I'd like to read this over more carefully before I sign anything," Chloe finally said. Rick's voice dropped into a lower, patronizing register, the tone men use when they want to sound reasonable while stripping away your choices. "Chloe, there's nothing complicated in there. It's a simple statement, showing we're all present and—" "I heard you, Rick," Chloe cut him off. Her voice didn't rise and it didn't shake. It just became incredibly clear and perfectly still, like water freezing over. "I said I need to read it carefully first. That's my decision." She set the paper back on the table and slid Rick's pen aside. The pressure in the room shifted instantly. It wasn't a dramatic clash. No one stood up, no one yelled, but something heavy moved through the closed space, like high pressure in a sealed cabin. Eleanor shot a quick, sharp look at me. It was a calculating glance, the look of an engineer assessing an unexpected structural defect. I looked right back at her, offering a completely blank expression. Sarah broke the silence. "Eleanor, maybe we should give her a minute?" "It's fine," Eleanor said smoothly, recovering her footing. "We have plenty of time. There's no rush." But the texture of her voice had changed. Just a fraction, but it was there. She was recalculating, I thought. Good. Let her feel the need to apply a bit more pressure. Eleanor turned and walked into the kitchen. 2 minutes later, she emerged carrying a tray. On it sat a steaming cup of chamomile tea, the perfect prop to showcase a wife's unceasing devotion. She walked over to my chair and, with that practiced natural grace, set the mug down on the side table next to me. "Have some tea, dear," she said, her voice filled with just the right amount of public care. It was a tone that drew an appreciative nod from Rick and softened Sarah's face into total validation. It will help settle your nerves. From the entryway, Frank Dorsey looked at the tea, then looked at me. He didn't say a word, but his weight shifted forward a fraction of an inch. I looked down at the mug. The familiar scent floated above the surface. Then I looked up at Eleanor. I looked around the room. Rick in the center, Sarah on the sofa, Chloe opposite me, Frank by the door, and Eleanor standing right beside me, still holding the empty tray. 6 people, the entire room sealed and waiting for me to take the drink that would prove my failing nerves. Now, I told myself, before I drink this, my voice was calm, unhurried, and carried clearly to every corner of the room. I have a question for you, Eleanor. She gave a flawless, gentle smile. Of course, dear. What is it? In your original plan, were you intending to have me walk down those 14 steep basement steps first? I leaned back in my chair, looking her straight in the eyes. Or were you planning on having me drink this cup of tea with a massive dose of lorazepam first? The room dropped into absolute crushing silence. It wasn't the silence of confusion. It was the dead quiet of a room full of people holding their breath at the exact same instant. Every single person stopped breathing. The smile on Eleanor's face didn't vanish. It just hung there, frozen like a pendulum catching mid-swing, stuck at the exact moment it was forced to become something else entirely. Arthur, what on earth are you? She began, her voice still trying to find that steady, patient tone of the long-suffering wife. Because the plan I found in the hidden compartment of your vintage document box, I interrupted, completely cutting her off, explicitly listed 2 options. Plan B, basement stairs, or the sleep medication, whichever acts first. I'm just trying to clarify which timeline we're currently on. The color drained from her face. It wasn't a dramatic flash of paleness, or a theatrical collapse, just a slow, silent retreat, like the light leaving a room as the sun moves past a window. She stopped. Go ahead, I encouraged her gently. You can explain it. You can't possibly prove... She stopped again, her jaw tightening sharply. You can't prove a dosage in a cup of tea. She heard the words as they left her mouth. I watched her realize, in that exact second, the absolute weight of what she had just admitted. Thank you, I said softly. That was exactly what I needed you to say. I pulled out my phone and hit send. 45 seconds later, the front door opened. Margaret Harper walked into the house, bringing the bitter December cold with her. Under her arm, she carried 3 thick folders, 1 red, 1 green, 1 yellow. Before we reveal exactly what happened next in that room, and believe me, it went in a direction no one saw coming, this was the moment the bridge, designed over 3 years, completely collapsed. Margaret walked over to the coffee table and set the folders down without saying a word. First the red, then the green, then the yellow. They lined up perfectly in the center of the table, completely covering the statement of family concern Eleanor had placed there 20 minutes earlier. She didn't bother moving the paper. She simply crushed it under the weight of the evidence. Then she stood up straight and let her gaze sweep across the room, locking eyes with every single person one by one. My name is Margaret Harper. I am the legal counsel for Arthur Pendleton. I need everyone to stay exactly where they are. Rick Hollis didn't stay put. His face turned bright red, that offended arrogance of his flaring up. Who let you in here? I did, I said, looking right at him. Mr. Pendleton retained my services 3 months ago, Margaret said, not even glancing at Rick as she flipped open the red folder. Part 1. Physical evidence and premeditation. 4 photographs. These were recovered from a hidden compartment built into a vintage leather document box. The modification was paid for in cash at Leo's repair shop on Main Street on April 14th of this year, a full 6 months before Mr. Pendleton even knew the box existed. She laid the photos out face up in a perfect row. A 12-step printed checklist titled Transition Plan with a target completion date of December 15th, and a handwritten note explicitly listing the basement stairs and sleep medication as alternative options. She paused, her eyes cutting straight to Eleanor. And I believe, about 4 minutes ago, we all heard a verbal admission regarding one of those options right here in this room. The house was so quiet you could hear the wind rattling the glass. Without missing a beat, she flipped open the green folder. Part 2. Financial Fraud and Illegal Asset Structuring. A formal report from the Fraud Division at First National Bank. It confirms that the signature on a durable financial power of attorney submitted this August carries a consistent mechanical deviation, proving it is an outright forgery. She placed Maya's report on the table, along with records of 4 transfers totaling $34,200. To avoid automatic federal flags, these funds were intentionally split into amounts under $10,000, which constitutes the federal felony of structuring. She pulled out the final few pages. This is the complete log of communications from your family accountant, Lena Marsh. It includes explicit instructions from Mrs. Eleanor Pendleton to transfer funds without Arthur's original signature, alongside Lena's formal, written refusals. Eleanor didn't say a single word. She stared intensely at that green folder, a look on her face I had never seen before. It wasn't anger or calculation. It was the desperate focus of someone trapped in a room with absolutely no exit, searching the walls for a microscopic crack. Margaret relentlessly opened the yellow folder. Part 3. Medical and Toxicological Evidence. 2 separate toxicology reports. They confirm that samples taken from the tea provided to Mr. Pendleton in November, and again this past Tuesday, contain severe concentrations of lorazepam. For a cardiovascular patient currently taking metoprolol, this specific combination is entirely capable of causing fatal bradycardia, disguised as a sudden cardiac event following an accidental fall. She slammed the final document, the one bearing the Penn Medicine letterhead, right on top of the pile. And finally, a comprehensive cognitive evaluation conducted by an independent neurological specialist at the University of Pennsylvania Health System, signed and dated December 10th. The report states unequivocally, Arthur Pendleton's cognitive function is fully intact, and his executive capacities are exceptional. Margaret closed all 3 folders and rested her hands flat on the table. Every single one of these core reports comes from an independent, third-party institution with 0 personal ties to the Pendleton family. The originals are secured in my office and with a notary public. A complete duplicate copy of this entire file was formally handed over to the Bucks County District Attorney's Office and local law enforcement this morning. She looked directly at Eleanor for the first time. Mrs. Pendleton, as a former legal professional yourself, I strongly advise you to say absolutely nothing else until your defense counsel is present. For 5 solid seconds, nobody moved. Then Rick Hollis snapped. He stood up, pointing a finger at the table. "This is all fabricated," he yelled, using the blind confidence of a man who had never been required to back up his words with facts, relying entirely on volume to win. "This is a total setup. You can't just barge into a private home and—" Margaret coldly pulled a stamped document from her briefcase. "This is a legally notarized affidavit signed by Leo Vincent on November 5th, confirming the custom billed and cash transaction for that hidden compartment. I have the certified original right here." She looked at Rick with a chillingly neutral expression. "You are welcome to challenge its legality, or you can sit down and remain silent before you find yourself facing charges of conspiracy to commit fraud." Rick sank heavily back into his chair, looking completely defeated. Sarah Mills buried her face in her hands and began to sob violently. Her eyes were red and swollen as her gaze darted between the folders. Eleanor and me, like a woman watching the entire reality she believed in, vanish right before her eyes. "I didn't know," she whispered brokenly. "Eleanor, I swear I didn't know. You told me he was so sick. You told me he didn't even recognize people anymore." "Shut up, Sarah," Eleanor said, her voice sharp as glass, a reflex defense mechanism from a woman trying to cut a fraying thread. "You don't know anything." Chloe stood up from her chair. She didn't say a word. She just walked straight over to my side and stood next to my high-back chair. She didn't hold my hand or make any grand emotional gesture. She just stood shoulder to shoulder with me. In that moment, it was more than enough. It was everything. Frank Dorsey, still leaning by the door, pulled the spiral notebook from his pocket. I have 6 weeks of daily written logs, backed up by time-stamped photos, he announced to the entire room. For every single day, this so-called care journal claims Arthur was confused, lost, or forgetful, I can provide exact proof of where he was and what he was doing. I'm entirely ready to hand this over to the prosecutors. Right then, the front door opened again. Martin Klein, the estate lawyer, stepped into the entryway carrying his briefcase. He took one look at the 3 open folders on the coffee table, saw Margaret Harper standing in total control of the room, and then saw Eleanor's ghostly face and Rick slumped in his chair. He froze instantly right where he stood. He'd been around the legal block long enough to recognize a total disaster when he saw one. Slowly, he lowered his briefcase to the floor by the door. "Ms. Harper," he said, clearing his throat, his voice very low. "Mr. Klein," Margaret replied, without even turning her head. "I think I'll need to speak with you privately at your earliest convenience." A thin layer of sweat had already formed on Martin's forehead. "Monday morning, 8 o'clock, my office," Margaret said flatly. Martin nodded, not even glancing at Eleanor, and backed out the front door like a man escaping a sinking toxic ship. Eleanor was now huddled in the corner of the sofa. Sometime during the last few minutes, she had retreated from her commanding position in the center of the room to the very edge of the cushions. Her hands were laced tight in her lap. Her eyes fixed entirely on those 3 folders, completely silent. I looked at her. For one long, uninterrupted minute, I just looked at the woman I had been married to for 40 years. "Margaret," I finally broke the silence, "make the call." 2 deputies from the Bucks County Sheriff's Department arrived at 4:15 p.m. Margaret had coordinates set with law enforcement before she even stepped through my door. The formal filing packets and all certified copies of the evidence had been delivered to the desk of the lead detective that morning. This wasn't a standard response to a 911 call. It was a coordinated arrest based on pre-filed felony charges. By the time the cruisers pulled into my driveway on Oak Street, the deputies knew exactly what they were walking into. They were incredibly quiet and professional. One deputy spoke briefly with Margaret at the door while the other waited in the hallway. When they stepped into the living room, Eleanor stood up. She very slowly smoothed down the skirt of her dark gray wool dress, the one she had put on this morning to celebrate the conclusion of her plan. She looked at the deputies, her voice chillingly clear. "I understand." Then, without looking at Rick or Sarah or Chloe, she looked at me. It was a long, heavy gaze that lasted 4 or 5 seconds, maybe longer. I had known this woman for 40 years. I had read her expressions across countless breakfast tables, in hospital waiting rooms, and in the front seats of cars on long road trips. But in that moment, I couldn't read a single thing in her eyes. There was no anger, no sadness, not even that cold calculation I'd grown used to over the last 2 weeks. It was something entirely foreign, a blankness I couldn't put a name to, and one I wouldn't be able to define for a very long time. Then she turned and followed the deputies out of the living room and through the front door. The bitter December wind rushed into the house for a brief second before the door clicked shut. The red and blue lights flashed against the driveway windows for a moment, then faded down Oak Street. The neighborhood went quiet again. The living room felt completely still. Rick Hollis was hurriedly putting on his overcoat, looking like a deflated balloon. Sarah was weeping silently into her tissues, and Frank stood by the window, hands deep in his pockets, watching the empty street outside. Chloe was still standing right next to me. "Are you all right, Dad?" she asked softly. I thought about the question. The honest answer was incredibly complicated, and I was entirely tired of complications. "I'm still standing," I said. She nodded, just like she had in the diner 2 days ago, as if that single fact was enough, as if that was the entire point. "Come on," she said, taking my arm. "Let's get something to eat in the kitchen." We walked back together, and I heard Frank follow us down the hall. Outside, the December night was coming on fast and early. The house felt quieter than it ever had before, but it was a clean silence, the kind of quiet that comes after a deep, necessary recovery. 3 days later, I was sitting in Margaret Harper's conference room for the 4th time. The table was completely clear, The folders were gone, secured in an evidence locker at the police station, barcoded and doing exactly what they were designed to do. Margaret sat across from me with a fresh legal pad. Chloe was next to me, her coat still on, a habit of hers that meant she only intended to stay long enough to hear the essential details before taking me home. "Here is where things stand," Margaret began, delivering the information with her usual unadorned, engineer-like clarity. "The district attorney's office has reviewed the entire file. Based on the evidence we submitted, she is facing multiple felony counts." Margaret checked them off on her fingers. First, forgery of a signature on a durable power of attorney, a third-degree felony in Pennsylvania, carrying a maximum of 7 years. Second, fraudulent transfer of $34,200 combined with structuring to evade federal reporting, which is severe financial fraud. Third, she paused, looking me squarely in the eye, administering dangerous doses of a prescription-controlled substance to an unwitting victim with a known cardiovascular condition with the intent to cause a fatal fall. The DA is using this as the foundation for a charge of attempted first-degree murder. If convicted, that carries a maximum sentence of 20 to 40 years, up to life imprisonment. Chloe sat perfectly rigid next to me, not moving a muscle. "Martin Klein contacted my office directly Saturday night," Margaret continued. "He's already cooperating fully with the prosecution. That guardianship petition, the one meant to strip away your rights, has now become the perfect piece of evidence proving her long-term intent." "What about our accountant, Lena?" I asked. "Lena spent yesterday morning with the investigators. She gave them total cooperation, handing over every email, every draft document, and her own logs of the calls, where Eleanor tried to force the asset transfers. The prosecution has explicitly stated she is not a target of the investigation." Margaret looked up from her pad. She made the right choice in the end. "A bit late," I murmured, "but it counts." "It absolutely counts," Margaret agreed, closing her pad. The room went quiet for a moment. It was the echo of something massive and heavy finally settling into place. "Arthur," Margaret's tone shifted. It was still professional, but it carried a directness she rarely showed outside of legal strategy. "You should know I've handled trust and estate fraud for 22 years. I have never seen a private citizen with absolutely no law enforcement authority build an airtight, 3-layered trap like this in the middle of a completely hostile environment without the other side suspecting a thing." She paused, a genuine look of respect in her eyes. "You did something incredibly difficult with absolute precision under psychological pressure that would have broken most people." I didn't know what to say. I looked down at the empty table where the 3 folders used to sit. "He had help?" Chloe said softly from beside me. "He certainly did," Margaret agreed. She looked at me. "Are you going to be okay, Arthur?" I thought about the same question Chloe had asked me in the kitchen 3 nights ago, while the dark winter evening was rushing in through the glass. "I will be," I said. "For now, that's enough." Maya Collins called me on a Monday morning at exactly 9:15 a.m. I was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee and reading the paper. Some routines remain the load-bearing walls of a life, even after everything else shatters. You don't realize their value until they're tested. Her voice carried that steady, reliable professionalism. "Mr. Pendleton, I wanted to give you an update personally before the formal notice goes out. The trust account held under Gavin Shaw's name was officially frozen by court order late Friday afternoon. The entire $34,200 is intact, down to the penny. The DA's office has already filed for a recovery order. Once the court approves it, the funds should be cleared back into your account in about 6 to 8 weeks. I set the paper down. "That's good news, Maya. Thank you." "There's one more thing," she said, her voice dropping into a quieter register, the tone used when reaching the real core of a case. "The investigation into Mr. Shaw's account led the DA's office to discover something they felt you had a right to know." A pause. The kind of pause that tells you a story is about to turn on its axis. Investigators recovered a hidden encrypted digital folder from Eleanor Pendleton's home office setup. Inside was a series of drafted, unfiled documents. They were a formal set of fraud allegations directed at Gavin Shaw, accusing him of using his position to embezzle major assets from the Pendleton family estate. I let the words settle into my head for a few seconds. As it turns out, Mr. Shaw had absolutely no idea about Plan B or the basement stairs, Maya explained carefully. According to the interview records, Eleanor told Shaw that you were experiencing severe cognitive decline and that these transfers were a legal asset protection structure to move funds out of your control before you made a decision that ruined the family financially. Shaw believed he was helping a worried wife protect a vulnerable husband, facilitating a legitimate transfer of assets. Maya let out a short sigh. He didn't ask enough questions, which the DA noted is a massive legal issue for him. But it's a completely different issue from the attempted murder charges Eleanor is facing. The evidence shows that once the funds were completely cleared, and once you were no longer an obstacle, Eleanor was planning to turn Gavin Shaw into law enforcement herself. She was going to use a criminal investigation against him to explain where the missing money went, completely clearing herself of any suspicion. I sat there in silence for a long time. Outside, the December sky was a flat, unyielding white, the kind of cold day that couldn't decide whether to drop snow or let the sun break through. She was planning to send her own partner to prison too, I said quietly. Every piece of data points to it, Maya replied. After hanging up, I called Margaret immediately. She listened to the breakdown without interrupting once. When I finished, she went silent for 3 full seconds. She built a perfectly designed machine, Margaret finally said, a rare touch of coldness in her delivery. And that machine was engineered to automatically eliminate anyone who knew too much once it finished its run, including the person who helped her turn it on. Is Gavin Shaw being charged? That depends on what he knew and when he knew it. Right now, he's cooperating frantically, trying to untangle himself from any connection to a homicide plot. Margaret paused. Word from the interview rooms is that he completely broke down when they showed him the timeline. I could see it in my head. I looked out at that flat, white sky and thought about the man in the dark jacket from the photos, standing confidently in that Center City hotel lobby, an average face in a crowd. He thought he was a partner in a massive financial windfall, completely unaware he was just a tool designed to be thrown into the furnace at the end of the script. No one was safe inside that system, I murmured, not even the person running it. The morning before Christmas, Chloe set up the tree in the living room. It was a small thing, barely 3 feet tall, bought from a nursery outside town with a distinct lean to the left near the top. Chloe insisted it had character, though I suspected it was simply the largest tree she could carry into the house by herself. Nathan arrived around noon. He'd driven all morning from Boston, bringing 2 bottles of Merlot and wearing the face of a man who had spent the highway miles sorting through a lifetime of thoughts, deciding to leave the heavy baggage on the porch for the evening. Frank knocked on the door at 5:30. He stomped the snow off his boots on the mat, holding a Tupperware container packed with gingerbread cookies. It was clearly made by a neighbor down the block, but he shamelessly claimed it as his own handmade contribution to the dinner. We ate at the kitchen table. Chloe had made our mother's pot roast recipe, the one Nathan had specifically asked for on the phone. Chloe had given a massive roll of her eyes during that call, but she'd gone ahead and made it anyway. Frank opened the Merlot. Nathan found the wine glasses in the cabinet above the fridge, the expensive crystal ones Eleanor used to keep reserved for dinner parties. He held them for a second, looking at them in the kitchen light, then set them on the counter without saying a word. Chloe took them from his hand and filled them quietly. Nobody mentioned the absence in the house. After dinner, Frank told that old story about his brother's dog and the Thanksgiving turkey. I'd heard it at least a dozen times. Nathan had heard it 4, and Chloe could probably recite the punchlines from memory. But it was the story Frank always brought out when he wanted to put laughter into a room, and it worked every single time because of the total conviction in his delivery, as if he still found the whole thing completely absurd and hilarious 20 years later. Nathan started laughing before the punchline even landed, trying to hold it back by looking at the ceiling with his mouth tight, but he completely lost it. By the time Frank got to the part where the neighbor's fence collapsed, Chloe had her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. I laughed too. It was the kind of laugh you haven't used in so long that your body has to remember how to make the sound. Later, when the dishes were done and the wine was mostly gone, Frank settled into a comfortable, half-asleep silence in the armchair by the window. I sat at the table with a mug of black coffee. I looked at the three of them, Nathan leaning back in his chair, Chloe slowly turning her empty glass on the wood, Frank watching the small, slightly crooked tree blink its lights in the corner. I thought about a woman who had spent 3 years meticulously planning to take this exact room away from me, to take this table, these people, and this specific quiet, the kind of stillness that means everyone in the space feels entirely safe enough not to need words to fill it. She had come incredibly close, just a few weeks short. "Merry Christmas, Arthur," Frank murmured from the chair, not even opening his eyes. "Merry Christmas, Frank," I said. On the morning of December the 26th, Leo unlocked the side door of his repair shop at 8 o'clock. The street was completely empty, carrying that specific post-holiday stillness, the quiet of a town taking a deep breath before the new year brings more complications. When I walked in, he was standing at his workbench, but he wasn't working. The surface was clear. He was just standing there with his hands at his sides. In front of him, resting on the wood, was the crimson leather document box. It was sealed inside a thick, clear plastic evidence bag with a label stuck to the front that I could read from across the room. Evidence ID, CR-2025-1847, Bucks County Sheriff's Department. We looked at each other for a second. "Margaret said the detectives are coming by to pick it up for court files this morning," Leo said. "I know," I said, walking across the room to stand next to him, looking down at the box through the plastic. I wanted to see it one more time before they took it. We stood there in silence for a few minutes, the two of us, and the evidence bag between us. The scent of leather and old wood that had filled this room for 28 years felt like the only witness left. "I almost didn't make that call, Arthur," Leo said softly. "When I found what was inside, I almost just put it back together and told myself it was none of my business." I turned my head to look at him. "What made you change your mind?" He was quiet for a long time. "I kept thinking about what would happen if I didn't. If I just handed it back to you, and then a few weeks later..." He trailed off. I just couldn't live with that outcome. He picked up a coffee mug from the edge of the bench, turning it in his hands. "I'm not a brave man, Arthur. I'm just someone who looked at what was written on those pages and couldn't find a way to live with the silence." "That's exactly what being brave means," I told him. He looked at me sideways with that same skepticism he used when checking a structural claim he didn't quite believe yet. "I mean it," I said. "You did the right thing. Everything we did to fight back started with that phone call." Leo set his mug down. He picked up a clipboard from the counter and handed it to me, the evidence transfer sheet. My name was at the top, with a blank line at the bottom for a signature. I signed my name and handed it back to him. We stood there for another minute. "You holding up okay?" he asked. "Better than I was?" I said. "One day at a time." He nodded. For him, that was a complete answer. I walked back out through the side door into the December chill. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking through the front window of the shop, watching that crimson box sit under the workbench lamp in its plastic sleeve. A document box with a broken brass lock. I had only wanted to get the latch fixed, I thought, and it ended up saving my life. On the morning of December 30th, I drove out toward the Delaware River, mostly because I didn't know where else to go. Not because I was lost, but because some places are built to hold a certain weight of thought. The water was a flat, dull gray with a few gulls circling low over the surface. It had always been the place I went when I needed to hear my own thoughts clearly. I parked the car and walked out to the edge of the river path. The wind was clean and direct, the way December always is in Pennsylvania. It doesn't bargain with you. It just arrives and tells you exactly where you stand. A man in coveralls was unloading some heavy crates from a flatbed truck near the old pier further down, his movements carrying that unhurried efficiency that comes from doing the same task 10,000 times. He glanced up as I walked past. "Cold one out today?" he said. "Yeah," I replied. "Forecast says it'll warm up by Thursday. I'll believe it when I feel it." He gave a short, genuine laugh and went back to his crates. I walked to the very end of the walkway, hands deep in my coat pockets, looking out across the wide expanse of water. I thought about those 40 years. I didn't try to think about the whole stretch. That's too much weight for a single morning. But I thought about the fragments. I thought about 1987, when Eleanor and I argued for 3 solid weeks over what kind of kitchen table to buy, finally settling on a compromise color that neither of us liked at first, but ended up keeping longer than any other piece of furniture. I thought about a road trip when Nathan was 8, fast asleep in the back seat, with his face pressed flat against the glass in a ridiculous way. I thought about a call from Chloe when she was 22 from her first apartment, telling me her stove was broken and then calling back 10 minutes later to proudly announce she'd fixed it herself. I thought about the real years, standing there in the cold wind with the sound of the truck unloading behind me and the city skyline gray in the distance. I decided to believe that for the vast majority of my life, the time had been exactly what it looked like on the surface. Maybe not the last 3 years, but for decades before that, the ordinary days were simply real. They were the years that shaped Chloe and Nathan, built a house where I could find my way in the dark with my eyes closed, and earned me a neighbor named Frank, who was willing to spend 6 weeks writing down daily details, just because he believed the truth mattered. That's a life. Not the unbreakable, flawless version I thought I had, but a real one nonetheless. The man with the truck finished his work and drove off, leaving just me and the gulls by the water. I stood there until the cold finally cut straight through my coat. Then I turned around, walked back to the Ford, started the engine, and drove home. I'm still here, I thought, watching the river fade in the rearview mirror. It wasn't for nothing. This is everything. I've lived long enough now to know that betrayal in a family doesn't usually sound like shouting. It's incredibly quiet. It hides behind shared dinners, inside familiar voices, and behind the very drawers and doors you never thought you'd need to lock. Looking back, the fatal mistake I made, the one that nearly cost me everything, was that I gave away absolute trust, and I stopped observing. Don't do what I did. Don't wait until a jam lock is the only thing left to save your life. My perspective on it is simple. Love should never be an excuse for blindness. You can love someone with everything you have, but you must keep your eyes open while you do it. Having a good heart doesn't mean you have to have a careless mind. I believe the world gives us tiny warning signals every single day. A lock that suddenly stops working, a name mentioned too casually, a drawer left open just a quarter inch too far. The real question is whether we are humble enough and sharp enough to pay attention.